Hello and welcome to the Helen Chris Show. I am your host, Helen Chris. This is a show where we tackle hard topics to make a better you and a better me. Today's topic is child abuse. In June of 2020, the World Health Organization reported nearly 300 million children ages 2 to 4 years old constantly suffers from physical punishment and or psychological violence at the hands of their parents or caregivers. Joining me today, I have Elise Bale. Elise is a dedicated Elise has dedicated over 18 years serving as a social worker with experience in child welfare, working with abuse and neglect cases, public health, and most currently works as a social worker within the school system. Welcome, Elise, and thank you for coming on.
Yes, welcome. Thank you for having me.
When we talk about child abuse, a lot of people only think physical abuse, but it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
What are other types of child abuse?
Well, the way child abuse is categorized, there's abuse, and then there's neglect, and then there's actual what they call dependency. And so your abuse cases are going to be a little bit more of the harsh type of abuse that you see, or harsh type of maltreatment that you might expect to hear about in children. So that could be things like physical injury to a child, that could be sexual abuse. And then there's also emotional abuse that fits into that category. And so emotional abuse is a little bit more tricky and difficult to investigate and to determine, but it's when a parent or a caregiver is saying things to a child or doing things to a child, and the result is detrimental to the child, like the child actually has lasting psychological issues with that emotional abuse that's taken place. And then so you get down into your neglect categories, and that could be inappropriate discipline. So you have things such as physical abuse or physical injury, but the inappropriate discipline may be things such as spanking and leaving marks and bruises on a child. So again, physical abuse is non-accidental abuse that's inflicted on a child. And then neglect issues could be a spanking, like a parent was genuinely spanking their child but got out of hand and caused some type of injury or mark or something like that on a child.
Okay. And it's funny that you say spankings. So growing up, we got spankings a lot.
All the time.
And it wasn't always with their hands. Like I got spanking with belts and switches. I even had to go out and get my own switches from the trees and bring it back in.
Correct.
With, yes. And
correct.
looking back now, I think those spankings actually made me a better person. And still today, many people still believe in spankings. What defines abuse? What are like the criteria that determines abuse, or is it just based on the discretion of that particular investigator who's investigating the case?
So whenever considering child abuse or just neglect, maltreatment, it has to go through an intake process. So someone has to pick up the phone and call to make that report. And so even before it gets into the investigator's hands, someone's called to make the report, and they go through a screening tool. These are mandates and policies that the state has put in place to make sure that it's consistent and that they're following the laws as it relates to what child abuse actually is. And I'll read you the definition in a second. Okay. But it's not even that person who takes the call's decision. They have to make a decision with the supervisor. So it's a 2-level decision before that case can even reach the hands of that investigator, before that investigator can even intervene and knock on that family's door. So it goes through the intake process. It's screened in. The investigator receives that report, and they go out and interview, investigate the situation. And so it's not up to that individual. Again, it's up to the policies and the screening tool, and that's how that part works. And what was the second part of your question, Ms. Helen?
It's basically, I just asked, like you defined abuse, and I asked what as far as the criteria. So you can answer that question. As far as, was it based on that individual investigator?
Right. So it's definitely not, but abuse is defined as intentional, maltreatment of a child. And then, of course, that abuse can be physical, it can be emotional, and then it can be a sexual type of abuse. So they're screening those different tools to see which track it's going to take and which type of investigator needs to handle those cases. Because as I mentioned earlier, there are situations of neglect that don't rise to that definition of abuse. Because a lot of times with abuse cases, you're going to have law enforcement involved too. Usually you're looking at criminal charges. That's also going to take place as well. So you have dual agencies, the Department of Social Services that investigates abuse and neglect, and then you're going to have law enforcement do their part as far as any criminal charges that need to come upon that caretaker or individual that inflicted that abuse on that child. So, did I answer your question?
You did. I want to throw something in if I can always take it out.
Yes, go ahead.
So when you talk about neglect, so what is the difference with that? Do your children still get taken away? Does the parents go through a process where they're educated on what they're doing? Because I noticed you said abuse is most likely the intent to harm versus neglect with that child. So what's the different responses that you'll typically see with abuse versus neglect?
So with the neglect, it could be things like improper care, and I want to say, there's resources out there for families to access food and things that they need, but it's improper care to the point where the family is not making any effort. So homelessness, you think about homelessness, that's what we deal with a lot, especially in the school system. We have a large homeless population. And so with homelessness, that's not abuse or neglect. But I can say that when a parent is not making effort to access resources to provide adequate shelter for a child, and there's available resources, then that becomes a different type of conversation. And the Department of Social Services can intervene. And again, if the parent's not making any effort to provide a safe space for their child, then a decision could be made to bring that into court for a judge to decide if it's best for that child to remain in that home or if the child needs another caretaker to stand in that place as the parent works to get themselves in a space where they can parent that child. And so I will say this, just by doing Child Protective Services and my experience with it, the role and goal is never to remove or break up a family. Even before those conversations are had, there's interventions, services that are put in place to keep families together. And there are obviously situations where children are in imminent risk, immediate danger, where decisions and quick decisions have to be made to protect children. So some other categories of neglect, we talked about improper discipline, but improper supervision is a big one. Here in North Carolina, there are no laws that say a child has to be a certain age to stay home. There's nothing to really say, a child age 6 can't stay home alone. But what they go by is like the fire marshal code. So the code will say no child under the age of 8 should be left home alone. But then you also have to consider like developmental appropriateness. You have a 12-year-old who's not appropriate to stay home alone, or a 12-year-old keeping younger siblings that just is not appropriate. So that does make it challenging, but they're really trying to determine if a child is home alone, do they know fire safety? Do they know how to get help? Do they know how to call a parent or the police or 911 to receive the help that they need if they are home alone? And then injurious environment, which you're talking about more like substance abuse in the home, domestic violence in the home, basically parents or caregivers exposing children to those things, because we've heard of cases in the news where there's domestic violence or substance abuse and kids have unfortunately been killed in those situations in those households. So those are reasons of why DSS or social services would become involved, and those fall under the neglect category as well. And then you have dependency too, which is a whole nother area of abuse and neglect. And so that's literally the parent saying, or the parent not making provisions for the child. Almost like back in the day when you hear about people dropping kids off at the fire department and things like that.
Right.
But a parent that literally has not, the child's kind of left to fend for themselves with no parent at all, and has to have a department stepping in and make arrangements for that child.
And it seems like that, kind of going back to the neglect part of it, social services, like you said, the goal is not to take the child away. So
Correct.
they provide, like, let's say child, no food in the home, places to stay. So do they offer resources for that parent, just if that parent need that information, as far as like if they don't have a home to stay in, or they don't have enough food in the home? Is that one of the aspects of it, to
Yeah,
deal
so
with that issue?
correct. So any resources available to assess if families are eligible for food stamps. There's local food pantries and food banks that are around that referrals can be completed to help family access food. There's sometimes programs where they can assist with housing. We live in a larger county, so resources are not readily available all the time. And so it does seem like people may come from other states or other counties and have experienced getting housing a lot quicker, or even assistance with childcare to eliminate supervision concerns. But when you come to such a larger county, it's a wait. And so that does, make a challenge for families as well. But yeah, the department should and would provide resources. And even you have your other systems. So I work in the schools. And so that's a big thing and a big role that we
Mm-hmm.
provide too. Like I have a pantry, a food pantry in my office when families fall
Okay.
short of receiving food items. That's not a call to DSS. That's not neglect. The family's reaching out for some assistance. So if their food stamps didn't come, or they just didn't budget it correctly and they're running short, or they lost their card, for emergency situations, those are things that the school and other agencies around could and should be able to provide to families.
I'm so glad you stated that. The goal is not to take the kids
It's
away, because
definitely not.
and a lot of people, a lot of times, they don't report certain things. Let's say a family that don't have a home, or a family who don't have food, and a lot of people don't report that because they're afraid that the child will be taken away from that parent.
Yeah.
Even though that parent is trying real hard. So I'm glad that you stated that, and I hope that helps someone. You can
Yeah.
still report things, because you can get that family help.
Yep. And I will say, even with the reporting part, I know in the state of North Carolina, every person is a mandated reporter. So you don't have to be a professional. You don't have to be a doctor, a teacher. You everybody's responsible for making sure children are safe. The neighbor, your cousin, your brother, you want to help, but when there's no help available and people aren't taking that help, then sometimes a larger agency has to intervene to make sure that the children are safe at the end of the day.
Awesome. So let's talk about parenting. Parenting overall is rewarding,
Oh, yes.
but it can also be very stressful. And
Yes.
due to the pandemic, you have many children who are spending more time at home. They're not
Mhm.
going to school. They're not going to daycare. What are some tips for parents to prevent becoming too stressed out, which sometimes can lead to abuse?
Right. So kind of like if you've ever flown a plane, not flown a plane, but been on a plane, the first thing they tell you is to make sure you put on your mask first. If there's ever an emergency, you put on your mask first, and then you help the people around you, be it your children, your spouse, your friends you're flying with, but you need to get that oxygen first. And so that's the same thing we're talking about when it comes to tips for parenting. Make sure you are well first, because if you're not, you can't care for, you can't help anybody else.
That's true.
You have to be okay first. And so, because I'm in the schools, a big thing that I push is family engagement for the schools, and even for families to be connected with the school. And so if you have school age children, especially learning during this pandemic, and they've been home a large part of this time, and you're having to be the teacher, you're having to be the custodian, you're having to be the everything in between. Definitely connect with your school, connect with your teachers. If you ever fall on hard times, and you're comfortable, share those things with your teachers so they understand and can show grace in those moments, and also connect you with the right people in the school. Your schools typically always have a school counselor. Not every school has a social worker, but you definitely can ask what support staff is available, so that you receive that support with the connection between school and home. And then other tips for parents, it's easier said than done because I'm working on this myself, but
Mm-hmm.
just plain and simple, just trying to get some exercise. It doesn't have to be going to the gym for hours on end.
Mm-hmm.
It could be taking a walk, getting some fresh air. If you're working from home, stop. Take time in your day to intentionally stop, put on some sneakers, walk around your block, and come back just to get your blood pumping and just, to get a little bit more energized and just decompress. Um, Make sure you're eating, healthier. You ain't got to be eating carrots and, the plain bland
Yeah.
food and that's it. But you want to make sure that you're incorporating some really good healthy things into your diet, not just eating processed foods and sugar all the time. Definitely getting enough sleep. Again, easier said than done, but
That is.
maybe, yeah, but maybe pick like 2 nights or 3 nights out of the work week where you have to get up to make sure you're intentional and get in bed at a decent time so you can get that good rest. Another biggie is don't be ashamed to ask for professional help.
Mm.
A lot of companies, a lot of people don't know about this, but a lot of companies have an employee assistance
Mm-hmm.
program or EAP, and a lot of times they provide counseling free. I mean, you're paying for it somewhere in your benefit, but as far as like actually, I mean, and maybe you're not. Sometimes the company pays 100% for that, but a lot of times they offer 6 free sessions depending on what the issue is, and we'll provide that counseling for you, your children, your spouse. You just have to check with your benefits, but it's a really good resource to plug into. And then once you finish those sessions, I would encourage you to maybe make sure that person takes your insurance so you can work with them on a copay situation and continue to be able to have someone to check in with um, that can help you just with your mental health needs. Deplugging from that media. Whew, I
That
tell
can
you,
be hard. This social media is ridiculous. So I have to
social
turn
media,
my
and
phone off.
yes, ma'am, and even the news, the
Oh
news
my,
is a mess.
yes.
So I know, a lot of the conversation is the vaccine. First, it was the virus, the pandemic, and
Mm-hmm.
we're not even hearing about that anymore. So now it's just focused on the vaccine. So the news really um, it just really controls our thoughts too. And it's done intentionally. These people know what they're doing on the news, what stories they
They
want to
do.
air, and how, they want people to act and respond. So deplug. And then as far as actually being in the house with your children, just to prevent child abuse and some other tips, positive discipline. And
Mm.
so, with social services and DSS getting involved, there is no law that says you cannot spank your kids. You can spank your children. But again, if you're spanking your children, let's say you're using a belt and that belt buckle um, flies out of your hand somehow because you're hitting a little too hard, you're just really upset and you're hitting too hard and hits that baby in the eye, now you have a problem. You have a
Right.
huge problem. And so, professionals, they'll always encourage to use positive discipline, which is more so focused on reinforcement of good behavior. If a child does something, hey, I like the way that you came into the house, put your things away, did what you needed to do without having a full tantrum about it, but just really rewarding and encouraging them and with the good behavior that you see. So that becomes consistent. And then the hopes are, the other things don't happen as much or at all.
Right.
And just creating structure in your home so that your children know what to expect. There's no surprises for them. They know what the routines are. That'll help with a lot of the discipline in the home. And then, of course, avoiding disciplining when you're angry, because we talked about the belt buckle. Sometimes children do things and our emotions get in the way, but we want to make sure if we ever have to discipline, especially physically, that we're in a good space ourselves and we're not angry with our children. And they also have, this is nationwide, they have a program, it's an evidence-based parenting program called Triple P. It's just very easy to search online, but it teaches that positive discipline and positive parenting model. Parents can access those resources free. There's usually Triple P certified um, clinicians in the area that can sometimes provide these services free or for minimum cost, or work with your insurance to really help you with some of the Triple P um, some of the triple P interventions. And so they provide like these tip sheets on things about children getting used to a new baby coming into the home, sharing, tantrums, just different things and experiences you may have with your children that require discipline, but helping you switch it and get into that positive discipline.
Who should they contact first? Who should they initially contact? Does it depend on, like, it's versus neglect, you'll contact the Department of Social Services, or versus abuse that you actually call the police officers?
Yeah, so always contact the Department of Social Services to make that report, because they are the agency over all of that, and they will get the information to law enforcement.
Okay.
I will say people can call law enforcement too, but you do want to make sure that the Department of Social Services has the information so that they can properly investigate these reports of abuse and neglect. So the Department of Social Services, they are responsible for sending these referrals and information to the proper people, because sometimes when people make reports, if it's not a caregiver, someone defined as a caregiver, then they have to do the proper steps to make sure it gets to the correct hands. So if it was a neighbor, they're not a caregiver. So it would more so be a law enforcement situation. But if you just start with step one and go ahead and report directly to the Department of Social Services, the child abuse hotline, they will again get it to the correct person. When you're reporting, you do not have to give your name. It can be anonymous. Okay. However, if you want information about, was this report accepted or was it not accepted, I would say it's always best to give your information and your name. That investigator going out to the home, by law, they cannot give the name of the reporter. Sometimes things are a little obvious and they may assume or know, like the family may assume or know who made that report. But that's not for us to worry about. It's for the investigator to go out and make sure they handle, do that investigation properly and get the family the help they need if that is the case. So with professionals, I always recommend please give your name, because you may need that documentation later to show that you truly did make a report. But again, it's not required that you give your name. You can report anonymously as well.
Okay. Elise, I truly thank you for joining me on today to talk about this very important topic. Thank you.
Hard conversations, but it's really important that, the public has this information, because we've been at home for almost a year, and it's kind of, we don't know what's going on in people's homes, and we've done some things virtually, and it's so crazy. We're getting a glimpse inside people's homes as we look at the students learning from home and just kind of sitting back and observing. Kind of could be considered invasion of privacy for some folks, I know.
Yeah.
Hopefully things get back to normal where kids are in the school building. But again, I understand that families are experiencing a lot, and child abuse, it doesn't discriminate. So it can happen to anybody. Anybody can be going through these things. Situations can change. So it's really important to get people the support and help that they need.
And I love when you said, anybody can report it too. So that some people don't know, what do I say? Who do I call? And so hopefully this episode today will help people to guide them who to call, who to contact. And, you don't have to say your name if you don't want to, because some people are very particular about that. They don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, whatever. However, they still want their child to be taken care of. So that's great. You can call without giving any information. Yes. So thank you again, Elise.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate
it. You're welcome. And thank you for joining the Helen Chris Show. Again, you can find me on YouTube at the Helen Chris Show. I am on Instagram. If you enjoyed this episode and look forward to more topics, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much, and God bless.